Hello, everyone. I'm Scott Adams. I'm an urban designer, and I'm a member of the Urban Design Group Executive Committee. We welcome you to this evening's exciting event on character and local distinctiveness. This event aims to focus our understanding on what we mean by character and local distinctiveness, something that I've thought about a lot as an urban designer, and also growing up in a really anonymous 1950s American suburb. So what do we mean when we talk about character and local distinctiveness? Is it architectural? Is it something about the shape of the buildings, the materials, or specific detailing? Is it more the public realm? Is it about the shape of the streets and the spaces? And what about the life of a place? And obviously, it's probably a little bit of everything, but it's going to be different to everyone as well. So how do we actually change anywherevilles to somewherevilles? We have an expert panel of speakers today to discuss some of these topics, and we'll be opening it up to your questions afterwards. First will be Rob Cowan of Urban Design Skills, who'll be talking about local distinctiveness, character and appearance, and what does it mean? He'll be followed by Chuck Wolfe of Seeing Better Cities, and he'll be discussing sustaining a city's culture and character deconstructed. Very interesting title. And finally, we'll have John Cooper of Oxford Brookes University discussing VIEWCUE and using computers to analyze streets. For a little bit of housekeeping, obviously it's an online setting, so please do keep your setting to mute. We'll be recording this session and we'll be uploading this to the website for general viewing in due course. We'd obviously like to thank Fergus at Urban House for this recording. We'd also like to encourage you to use the chat function during the session, where you can share your thoughts and ideas and also raise questions. And that'll be followed by the more formal Q&A at the end of the session. So first, I'll introduce Rob Cowan as a first speaker of Urban Design Skills. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Scott. I'm only going to talk for a very few minutes at all. And in fact, only the first minute will be worth listening to. But it will be worth listening to because I've got the answer to this. And the answer is that we use the Coventry test. And what this means is that whenever you read or write a plan or a strategy, any planning or urban design document, you replace the name of the place in the document with Coventry. And if the document then applies to Coventry as well as the place you're talking about, then you're not actually writing about anything about locally distinctive about the place that you're meant to be planning. And applying the Coventry test, and by the way, of course, it's important to say that the Coventry test doesn't work in Coventry. So if you're working on a plan for Coventry, you have to use the Birkenhead test or any other test you want to use. But for everywhere else, we use the Coventry test because Coventry is an easy city name to remember. And I can't prove this, but actually in 30 years' time, you will find you still remember the term, the Coventry test. You may not remember what it was, but you'll remember that. So, if you go through your document and you find there's a vast amount of stuff that doesn't pass the Coventry test, it's just generic planning, urban design stuff, policy or whatever. And you'll find it in the National Planning Policy Framework or in the National Design Guide. So there's probably no point in, and in lots of other books about urban design and planning, there's no point in having it in your plan. The point of a plan is to say something about the actual place that we're planning. And to do that, we need to understand the place. So there's two things, really. First of all, understanding the place, understanding what we talk about its character and what's distinctive about it, what's special about it. That's half of planning. And then the other half is trying to say something about how that character can be applied to new development. And these are both quite difficult things to do. And if we can't do them, well, okay, we can't plan. If we want to do proper planning and urban design, we need to do both of those things. Where did this all come from? I suppose Ian Nairn was in 1955 in Subtopia, was one of an early writer who was talking about subtopia. I suppose the term means sub, less than, topia, place. So he was complaining that actually development was creating places that were no places. They were totally indistinguished, and he thought that in a few years' time you would be able to go from one end of the country to the other, and it would all look exactly the same, which he found incredibly dispiriting, and he was trying to find ways of avoiding this. And I think we've been trying to do it ever since. Although if you go back to the 1890s, you find that Patrick Geddes was saying exactly the same sort of thing and came up with the solution, which was that planning and urban design were things you did with a particular community, and it involved working with the bunch of people who live there, everything from children to adults of all ages. He started his planning with running festivals because he wanted to know not just what the place looked like, but what its life was, what people thought about, what was the history, what was important to people. He wanted to help people understand their local area, how it works, what was good and bad about it, but also it at every stage from the very local to the regional. So Patrick Geddes knew how to plan, and gradually over the years we've lost this knowledge and ability. I suppose there are some places that have local distinctiveness, which is relatively easy to determine. The Cotswolds, there is a Cotswolds style, and you can look up to see how to build in the Cotswolds. There's a Bath guidance which tells you how to design in Bath. People have written about Welshness and Scottishness, saying that depending on what region you're in, there are certain characteristics of Wales and Scotland about how people build, which are very different to how people build in regions of England. And we need to understand what these characteristics are. Some of them are due to the local vernacular, the way that people built, the technologies that people had at the time, the building materials. So we need to say, well, if those technologies no longer hold, if now we've got longer beams to span roofs than just the local trees, we've got easy ways to bring in materials other than just the local materials. What does that mean? We need to think about that. But it's a process of thinking about what is important, and that's how planning should work. And I think using design statements is, it's always good to look at a development and to see, are the designers producing design statements that tell the story of how the design team have appraised the place, not just as professionals, but how they've done that by talking to local people, involving local people in the process of planning, and then having decided what's important and what is characterful and locally distinctive, not just in a way of saying, oh, actually the local building material is flint, so let's use flint, but in really looking at every aspect of the place, from its layout, its materials, its movement patterns, its culture, what people do. Having determined that, then the next stage of the design statement is telling the story of how that information has been turned into a design. And again, it's very interesting to see, we need to know the thought process about that. So it's about thinking from the early stages, thinking about the place, to actually coming up with a design. And that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. I appreciate the Coventry test. It was actually the first place I ever worked. I was sent to Coventry when I went to the UK in 2003. So I appreciate it.
They're still talking about you.
Sorry?
They're still talking about you.
Oh, I know. I'm not allowed back, apparently. Thank you very much. And we'll next move on to Chuck Wolfe.
Thank you, Scott. Let me share my screen. Well, I hope that the Coventry test is in Rob's dictionary. That's all I can say. Rob and I talk a lot about these things. And actually, before I came to the UK, going on 4 years ago, I had come across Rob's work with Place Check and used it a lot in my second book, Seeing the Better City. And so it's been an honor to get to know everyone since I've been here. Robert asked me to join this panel, and I'm honored to do so. I think mostly surrounding my new book, Sustaining a City's Culture and Character, which is about to be in its release season in the United Kingdom. It's been out in the US for a little while, just a few weeks, and it will be rolling out here over the coming weeks. And I don't mean to be self-indulgent here, but I am very proud of a trilogy that I think I've inadvertently crafted. And my writing is really very, very compatible with the analysis that Rob just provided. It's about getting to know a place, and it's about getting to know a place and being very careful with words like character in ways that Rob has somewhat outlined. And so this new book is intended to be a bit of a guide to figuring out what character really is. And the key to that is context. So, American tourists, when they used to arrive, and maybe they will again. I still interface with a lot of people who come and visit, as I'm sure you all do. This is character, isn't it? This is Tower of London. And if you're going to be sophisticated about character, you're going to look at the heritage, you're going to look at the shard in the background. But more important than that, you're going to look at layers of development. You're going to look at how perhaps the character of different eras is represented in the built environment. And then it is permissible and very appropriate to look also at the underlying natural environment. And this is something that, as some of you know, Professor Cowan has brought on board for his third edition of his epic textbook, that if there's a clean slate, a new site, one should receive the natural environment as the basis for a design statement as well. And so we have both a groomed natural environment and a more organic natural environment in this photo. Now, design statements. Well, my wife and I recently purchased one of the oldest homes in Newbury, and here it is. And again, this is not about self-indulgence. It's about the fact that in the design plan for Newbury that was done, the most recent consultant-based plan that was done in 2017 or 18, they picked our house as emblematic of the history of Newbury. A cottage dating from 1550 during the time of the medieval or post-medieval textile industry here. And I would say, okay, that's great. And I appreciate my American friends writing and making faulty towers jokes and asking if we're going to open a bed and breakfast. But that's really what isn't going on, to my mind, because one needs to look at the layers. And even if going forward as planners, designers, recovering lawyers such as myself are going to work on a site, I would argue that even if the historic features of a site or the latent natural features of a site are not going to be used going forward. One needs to understand what they are. Here you see the River Lamburn against our garden. And guess what? Here you see the front side of the house in what was the village of Shaw, now the north end of Newbury, now a highway, and not necessarily consistent with this house that watched the Second Battle of Newbury start on its doorstep in what was the year, 1643, 44. So, places change, and that is what is so important. It is trite to say so, but we really, really have to embrace that. And all the post-pandemic planning and thought, we have time to think about this again. Now, back to a London borough, Hounslow, some of you will recognize Isleworth. And isn't this quaint? Isn't this character? Well, we have a bit of a questionable modification to the ancient church, which we can debate now. This came from a different period of British architecture. But this goes to my point, and to some degree what Rob was saying, that people use the words character and authenticity oftentimes without thinking what they mean. And the Coventry test is a useful way to get at that. I tend to be way too verbose and talk about bigger words such as ambiguity or vagueness. And so much of what I am writing about now is helping people take these words apart, and sometimes even arguing they mean nothing at all, devoid of what? Context. Now, even in Isleworth, it is fun. That's the wrong word to use. It's interesting to go look at the plague pit that is adjacent to that church and to wed the past and present in a very interesting way. Now, is that going to factor into a future design on the site? No, but it's an important thing to know. And it's an important way to use heritage that just isn't, to use the American term, historic preservation. All of this is part of a site. And I can go on forever about that, so I won't. You might ask then, what is the solution? And I come up with, in my writing, I like to come up with cute acronyms. But before I get to that, even before the pandemic, I wrote these words. And of course, this is just ideal because it's exactly what's happening right now. Imagine if the city around you or the world around you disappeared and everything familiar vanished. And then you have to reinvent it. What would you do? And what would you think about? Perhaps some people would think character, as in some of the post-war planning, not so much here, but particularly on the continent, you go back and, well, you pick a certain level, certain era of development, and the architecture gets replicated. Well, no, I don't think that's relevant in the age of equity, social justice, and climate change. So we need to come up with a blend. We need to come up with a combination. And here's Neal's Yard, as some of you will recognize, already very changed from the first time I saw it in 1999. Some would say gentrified, but character is ambiguous, if you'll accept that premise. I, in the book, quote Mr. Cowan, who was too humble to quote himself a few moments ago. But Rob has pointed out that character is nothing but the sum of attributes. Yes, it is physical, but that's the sum of the attributes. So you have to know the attributes to understand the physical. And through others, including a gentleman named Andy Day, who has come up with an excellent study guide for A-level geography tests, in this country. He has a panoply of ways to understand the character of a place. Kim Dovey, the academic out of Melbourne, Daria Okte, urban morphologist, we come to the term assemblage as a convenient word. Character is not just the physical environment, but it's an assemblage of all of these things. Now, how do you determine what that is? And I started to say a moment ago, I've come up with cute acronyms. LEARN. It's a modification of something I had in a former book. Look, engage, assess, review, and negotiate, and filter through context keys of familiarity, congruity, and integrity. Now, those are not intended to be hard and fast data producing labels. They are meant to be ways to force a good think about a project. And yeah, there's diagrams, and we don't have time for that today, but just to let you know, I've thought about this structurally as well. Some of you may be sitting there, standing there, walking along in your phone, watching this and saying, yeah, but we don't always have time to do this for all projects. I admit that. And I'm not arguing that this is an inflexible tool, but it's a thought-provoking device. So let's think about a few situations before I end where, well, character may have been handled, how shall we say, in a questionable manner or not, depending on one's perspective. How would you look at a scenario like this? This is in Reading, and say, well, now how do we really figure out what happened there or what's going on here? Of course, a lot of it has to do with plot ownership and economic factors. I don't mean to deny those, but I have here a range of all of the things that go into character, all of the things that create that assemblage. And if you're familiar with Richard Guys' work in Guys and Webb, where they really take on this in a book from 2018, and Matthew Carmona reproduces it in his new volume. It's a cloud diagram of components of character. In my chapter 3, I include all of these types of things that can help inform. Will this happen on all projects? No. Will it happen at King's Cross? Maybe. Another example along the way in Hounslow, if something's up here and maybe they should have used the learn method. But this, of course, shows some of the absurd combinations of things we have around the world where perhaps they could have been blended in a better way. Perhaps there's nowhere better to think about this type of deep dive as in Berlin, where in former West Berlin, you see the fruits of capitalism, multiculturalism, buildings under construction, and still a bombed church from the Second World War. Not unlike London, but these are the opportunities for the rich thinking that I like to propose. Speaking of King's Cross, at Coal Drops, one can argue the success or failure of this development. Most people think rather fondly of it. There's not much green in the interior, is there? Someone could raise that point. But here you see repurposings that both retain and bridge and provoke. And I think this is where you get when you have a harder think in the ways I've suggested. Now, the book has several examples, and I'm almost done here. Going clockwise, or let's go counterclockwise. In the snow is the northern Swedish city of Kiruna, where I went for a few days to understand the process by which they moved the town, or a good part of the town, because of subsidence. Kiruna is a coal town, as you may know, and it essentially, the subsidence means the town collapsing on itself because of mining underneath. Because of vast resources and Swedish law, they had to move the town, with the coal company paying for it. But the planners involved spent a lot of time dialoguing with the citizens in deciding what to take with. And they took with a mixture of moved buildings, artifacts, design styles, and so on and so forth. It's absolutely fascinating, and it shows what happens when there's time to really immerse. Lower left, several young Irish architects that I met at the Biennale in 2018 or 19, it's hard to remember these days, involved in what was the Irish Pavilion, having to do with grabbing the bones back from 6 Irish market towns, and with a very permissive, inclusive way of listening and bringing back the best of what was in the 21st century. I went to Macroom near Cork and saw what they were up to. Moving to the middle on the bottom, most of you will recognize Bloomberg's European headquarters, the oldest street in London, brought back with subsidized businesses. And I know Rob has run this building through some testing for his pending book. If nothing else, I think Foster was very contextual here. They moved the Mithraeum back to its rightful place. They did a lot in considering the site. Some people might disagree, but very, very contextual and also reflective of deep thought. Moving around to counterclockwise, I spent a lot of time with the We Are Waterloo Business Improvement District, which is attempting to bring back in the form of a starter market, Lower Marsh, that historic market that has been for hundreds of years, at least, part of what remains between Vauxhall and a market that ran from Vauxhall to Blackfriars. Finally, the top two, the very top in Melbourne, Federation Square, the one in the middle, Koningsgarden in Stockholm, where Apple, which you may remember, decided it was going to build town square headquarters stores, somewhat like the one in Covent Garden a few years ago. Guess what? They were rejected here because of the context and because Apple did not do its due diligence to figure out whether their ideas would work in these particular cities. So, in closing, a little Banksy here. You don't need planning permission to build castles in the sky. I don't know if that really applies to what I'm saying, but it sounds good. I think what I'm really saying is that it's more than a black and white proposition. I'm arguing for as deep a dive as one can perform, and it should be a careful blend that takes into account many, many things and many, many sub-environments of a given place. Now, rail arches at almost at Waterloo. Quick story. Character? Nah, maybe. But bobtail fruit from the old Covent Garden through several tube stops with their stalls no longer has a physical presence other than a warehouse in one of those arch storage areas. But they still deliver, and they delivered during the pandemic with the same customer service as the original owner in the old Covent Garden. And they still are involved in the communities they were once involved in. This is a sort of virtual character that we now have the opportunity to think about much more based on the last year. Finally, this was a beta reader of the book, so you don't have to be interested. He wasn't. Actually, I purchased this mock-up just to entertain people like you all, and I can't hear you laugh, unfortunately. That's it. Thank you for your indulgence. I probably went a little bit over time, but I hope you have a little more expansive view of character than you might have before.
Thanks, Chuck. Really interesting. And seeing Federation Square in Melbourne was an interesting example because it was such a new public space that everyone in the city really loved, that it was quite interesting. There was such a strong opposition to the Apple Store. So it kind of shows how character can focus not only on the historical, but also the contemporary. And next, we'll move on to John Cooper for the final presentation. John?
Okay, thanks, Scott, Rob, Chuck. Hello, everybody. There's a big advantage to going last. Going last, you can pick up things that people have said before you that are really clever, and you can almost pretend that they're your own. I won't pretend. The stuff I'm going to talk about is actually quite different from what we've seen so far. But the things I'm going to talk about are a new concept that I'd like to introduce to people, which is a concept of visual texture. And so my session is really about how what new tools might be available? And I know I've been given this billing that, using computers to analyse streets. Well, yes, I do use computer technology to analyse the character of streets by measuring what I term the visual texture of place. And I think it's potentially very useful to us in terms of the things that are written in the emerging new model design code, in terms of establishing baselines that we can actually use to very quickly identify character areas, character zones, or even street segments. Now, I've been watching the chat coming in, and there's a word that keeps being repeated. It's the dreaded P word. Would anybody like to tell me what the P word is? It is pastiche, Ashley. I saw you on the little screen. Well done. So I'm hoping that what I can show you, which is delivered through a tool that I call VIEWCUE, it measures the visual texture of place, and I'm hoping that you might find it helpful in drawing out what I call the deep character, or the DNA of a place, in terms of, although we can write design codes where we specify morphological characteristics, we can specify the width of the street, the size of the plot setback, the heights of the buildings, etc., the materials, we don't, I feel, have a tool until now that actually tells us anything about the composite whole. How do we feel about the whole thing when it comes together? A lot of the examples that Chuck showed I thought were really visually interesting, and I have in the past run lots of kind of design workshops with stakeholders, community groups, and it tends to be the places that people liked were places that have got what I describe as lots of accident, bits and pieces that seem to have evolved. They've evolved within some kind of theme, but they deliver variation. Based on a branch of mathematics known as fractal geometry, which is where I started 20 years ago, there are techniques that can allow us to actually quantify the degree of irregularity or kind of almost accident in a place. Now, at this point, I'm going to ask Robert Huxford if he can actually play the 14-minute video, and we'll see how it goes. If it doesn't play, I have got a substitute fallback position. So can we give that a go?
Welcome to Visual Texture, a new method for character identification.
Okay.
We have three key aims. Firstly, introduce the concept of visual texture, present a new way of classifying views, and introduce a new character encoding tool. We'll look at uses, visual texture, view classification, character map examples, and then look at VIEWCUE4. As a basis for coding, VIEWCUE can identify character areas that reflect user experience, provide baseline data, establish visual targets, and provide evidence of understanding and change. By assessing the content of Google Street View or bespoke images, VIEWCUE measures the composite effect of everything that makes up a scene and affects character. We refer to this as visual texture. We combine the measurement of visual texture level and texture type to create a new unique view classification used to identify and map character areas. We plot visual texture levels from low to high and texture type from urban to natural to create 9 major view categories. Each category reflects the visual characteristics of different locations. These examples illustrate each of the 9 major view type categories, from low to high urban textures on the left, through to low to high natural textures on the right. Each one reflecting the combined physical characteristics of the location. We can further break down the 9 categories into specific view classifications. This allows us to provide each view with an identifier based on its level of visual texture and its texture type from urban through to natural. View classification data is easily mapped using the VIEWCUE toolkit, or easily exported into ArcGIS to identify character areas, zones, and even street segments from Google Street View images. So, let's now look at how we can use the cloud-based VIEWCUE toolkit to quickly identify visual character and character areas from a street level perspective using Google Street View or bespoke images. Welcome to VIEWCUE 4.0. What we see on the screen now is a heat map of the centre of Bath. A heat map showing the distribution of visual texture level of Bath from a survey of 2,500 stations that equates to around 20,000 Google Street View images. The map we're looking at shows texture level. The darker the red, the higher the texture level. The lighter the colour, the lower the texture level. On the right of the screen we can see a dashboard that tells us about the project, its location, number of stations, number of routes, and numbers of views. It gives us indications of the average maximum and minimum values of texture level, similarly for texture type, and also gives us levels of texture variation along routes. The chart below compares information from this project in the solid line with information as a baseline for all projects in the VIEWCUE database. On this chart we can see that the visual texture level of Bath is noticeably higher than the average for the rest of the projects in the database. If we zoom in, we can see what this is showing us in terms of the character of the streets. So, now we're in the centre of Bath. Each of the coloured circles represents what we describe as a station. Each station has 8 views, making up a 360-degree view of that specific point in the city. If we select a station, we'll activate an image gallery, and if we scroll down, we'll see 8 views at that particular location. We'll also notice on the top left of each image our visual classification that we looked at earlier. This is showing us that this street is a highly urban street with a very, very small percentage of vegetation. Down here we get the visual texture level of almost 7.5, and if we hover over the fuel gauge we get an indication that this image contains less than 3% vegetation. If we want to see a place with a low level of visual texture, we can select a light coloured station. We can immediately see a difference in the character of the place. We can see much longer views, lower levels of enclosure and more open space, but with a slightly higher level of vegetation, leading to a visual texture level of 4.7 and a vegetation estimate of around 6%. Let's scroll back up and we can look at the next type of data that's available. At the moment we're looking at the visual texture level as an average for all images at each station. But we can choose different view types. We can choose to examine information for the vistas, forward and back along the street. And you'll see the chart down here has changed to get a different profile. We can look at the information just for the elevational views on either side of the street, and again you'll see that the profile on the chart has changed. Or we can choose to look at views that are 45 degrees etc., the oblique views, and yet again you'll see that the chart has changed. Let's go back to looking at all views, at the average texture level for all views for each station. And now let's change from looking at texture level to looking at texture type. So, when we looked at our first street, we saw that it had a high visual texture level, but it's a very tight urban street, and so its colour is orange on our type scale. If we scroll up and choose one of the green type circles, we'll see a visual texture that is predominantly a natural texture. In this case, the view is classified as an X100. It has a very high visual texture of almost 8.5, with around about 55% of the view being comprised of green vegetation. So far, we've looked at the visual texture level and the texture type. Now let's look at them in combination to arrive at our view classification. Now we can see a map that we're familiar with, that we looked at in the earlier part of the presentation. We can see the distribution of different texture types, from the highly urban textures to the highly natural textures, and conversely the low urban to the low natural textures. And we can see distinct character areas starting to emerge. If we look to the right of the screen, we can see the 9 broad categories of view type. The percentage figures tell us the proportion of stations that fall within each of the view type categories for this particular project. The figures in brackets show the baseline of all projects in the VIEWCUE database. Immediately we can see, standing out in dark purple, the historic core of the city. Lighter purple indicating locations with a slightly lower but still highly urban texture, and then those locations dominated by vegetation emerging on the periphery. To see this data in more detail, we can select the Category Reporting button. This opens a new window and will show us how many stations are sitting within each of the 9 broad view type categories. Scrolling down to the View Classification matrix, the numbers tell us how many stations fall within each of the more specific individual image classifications within the main category types. So far we've looked at percentages and numbers of stations, and stations are collections of 8 images, but we can also examine this data by individual view and by view type. We can select views rather than stations and turn off some of the image types to only look at vistas. This allows us to see what these view classifications look like on this project. If we select the Fetch Data button, we'll see the numbers of individual images that fall within each of the 9 view categories, from our low to high predominantly urban textures, the low to mid-range mixed textures, and the low to high natural textures. Here in the detail matrix we can see the number of images in each of the individual classification cells. This matrix is live if you want to see, for example, what does a T5 look like? What do all the T5s in the sample look like? And here are examples of all the T5s in this project. You'll see just by glancing that they fall into a particular character type in terms of length of view, amount of built form, and degrees of enclosure. Let's look at something by way of a contrast, and instead of looking at a high urban texture, let's have a look at a high natural texture. We'll select X100 from the classification matrix. These are all the images for views that we've recorded as X100. Remembering that these are all extracted from Google Street View, in terms of the speed of extraction, each image takes about 1 second to be selected, processed and recorded. We can also measure the variation or change in visual texture along a route, which has a direct link to the experience someone may have in walking down a particular street. The darker the colour on the map, the more varied the texture along that particular route. The lighter the colour, the more uniform the texture along that route, and therefore the more uniform your experience of moving through that place. Here are 3 examples of routes with different levels of variation. The first example is highly varied, taking a pedestrian through a series of narrow spaces and open spaces, much along the lines of Gordon Cullen's serial vision. We quantify this with a variation coefficient of around 10%. The second example is moderately varied, with a variation coefficient of 3.7%. This final example has a high level of uniformity, where its visual texture changes very little as you progress along its length. Let's return to our combined view categories map. So this is what we started with, and just as a reminder, we could outline the centre of Bath, and we can identify and then specify its particular character. And what we'll do next is to zoom in on this and look at this in more detail where we'll compare the results of our visual texture survey and our view classification with a more traditional morphological study of the centre of Bath. In 2015, Carl Kropf and Pete Ferguson undertook a tissue analysis of the centre of Bath. This plan shows the distribution of character areas identified in the tissue analysis. Superimposing a visual texture survey shows a clear correlation between the boundaries of areas identified using traditional methods and those areas identified through their visual texture as having a unique character. For example, you can see the historic core, Henrietta Park, and a more recent development to the northeast. In addition to the survey tool, VIEWCUE also has an assessment tool. The assessment tool can help quantify the degree of change in a view as part of a visual impact assessment and be used to demonstrate that visual texture targets that may have been specified in the design code have been achieved. And it can help quantify the difference between an existing situation and a proposal or a series of options. So how and when do we use visual texture analysis in terms of character encoding? Use visual texture mapping as the first step in identifying character areas, zones and segments. Use it to establish visual targets within a design code and use the assessment tool to demonstrate that visual targets have been met. VIEWCUE 4 can help you deliver the requirements of the emerging National Model Design Code by providing street-level visual data that complements and adds to traditional methods. We've been looking at visual texture and the new VIEWCUE 4 visual analysis tool,
Stop the video at this point.
an appraisal method and a tool that can be used to characterise place. Remember, it's...
That's better. Sorry about the speed, folks. I think there's a broadband issue. When it runs at its full time, it's Jane Thomas. It's not too long. Okay, Scott, do you want to share questions?
Sure. It's really interesting seeing the three presentations and the contrast from the subtopia, the non-place focus that Rob talked about and leading to talking about what is important and how do we think about a place, to moving to the assemblage of attributes of a place with more of a holistic approach, which kind of fed into the analysis too in the last presentation as well. And whilst there was a lot to talk about pastiche, it's good, it's bad, it's about copying, it's kitsch, it's quite fascinating. What really drew my attention was Stella Jackson's point, isn't character essentially subjective? And the focus that it's not necessarily the analysis of it, but the feeling or the view of what a place is. And that made me think about how much I love a post-industrial landscape, whether it's just a derelict place or if it's repurposed for different uses and events. And so I guess I'd just like to start out questions of just understanding in the order that you presented, what you think about that statement, that the subjective nature of character and local distinctiveness. Rob? You're on mute.
Yep. I think character is subjective. It depends on your values and what you like. Much of what we're responding to is obviously objective. There's stuff there. In my local area, a South London town, the local authority did a sort of an assessment of the town centre to try and and what they said they did was identify the DNA of the town centre, and they identified some buildings made of London stock brick, some of red brick, some of Portland stone, some of red brick and terracotta, and they identified which of these were popular by consulting people, and they came to the conclusion that the DNA of the town was made up of these particular building types, and therefore new development should try and plan design within that DNA. But of course, the problem was what they were assessing. The reason why these buildings were in those materials and those architectural styles was largely to do with the time when they were built. So the big building in Portland stone was built in the 1930s, when strict classicist buildings in Portland stone were the common style for civic architecture. The London stock bricks houses were built at a time when London stock was the cheaper or fashionable material, and the red bricks when red bricks were in fashion. The terracotta was at that particular time in architecture when people were building in terracotta. So to identify these as the DNA and then say this is what people value and this is what developers today should respond to, isn't really very helpful to the developers, because actually what people are responding to is, what they like is old buildings that are handcrafted with lots of detail. Well, we don't have an option today to build old buildings handcrafted with lots of handmade detail. So we need to think about other aspects of the character that can depend on, that can help to influence design, and that respond to what people feel about and value. So the answer, yes, we need to understand exactly what it is that people are responding to, and what they respond to in new developments, what they like about new developments and why they like about those. Okay.
Thanks, Rob. Sorry, I was just unmuting myself. And can I ask the same thing of Chuck, please?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Scott. I agree with Rob. Of course, the character is subjective. This is something I've spent a career addressing, because I was a lawyer advocating for and against, essentially, projects that people like and did not like. And in the United States, I think it's instructive, just for a moment, to talk about how these things proceed in the United States. It has a lot to do with the existing English discussion on design quality and place quality alliance that Matthew, who I think is still in the audience, has overseen, and the design code discussion that's going on right now. Well, guess what? In the United States, the law of due process, both procedural and substantive, meaning essentially fundamental fairness, governs these types of issues. And there are some landmark legal cases in the United States that have overturned municipal decisions that are way too much based on unpredictable whims of decision makers, be they planning staff or be they citizen commissioners. And so you might say, well, what's the solution? The solution ends up being a design code that is sufficiently clear to pass muster for these fundamental fairness issues, but also attempts to nuance some of the issues which Rob just reflected upon. And I also talked about with regard to, conveniently, our house in Newbury, which somehow is seen as the design aesthetic of Newbury. So it is a slippery slope. It is very contextual. There's always going to be a balance of subjective and objective. And hence the discussion that I also saw in the chat about consulting with the people who know the place best, which are those people who live there. And you know what? It may not be that classical architecture becomes the character of a place currently. Now, I can give you a quick example because I've experimented while I was waiting for the book to be published 3 months after it was supposed to. Well, thank you, pandemic. I started doing some videos that I called place parts here in Newbury during the third lockdown. And I went to a housing development up the street done by David Wilson Homes, who do a lot of brick mixed density, mixed use a bit, but certainly multifamily, single family. They do nice projects for those who care about character and traditionalism. However, when I got in discussion with tradespeople about this issue, working at the house or just out and about, people pointed out that the most affordable homes were right against in the project I'm thinking of, the A339, or the junction of the A4 and the A339. That's about character too. You can put the most loyal, aged brick, which probably comes from China these days, by the way, on a site, make it look like it's been there for many years and is compatible with a crescent from the 19th century across the highway. That's important. But what is also important is the placement of the multifamily part of a new development. And I think that you cannot escape now the social justice and equitable aspects of character when you balance the subjective and objective. So it's not a straight answer. It's a good old lawyerly, it depends answer. But I really believe that that's why I've come to, in my post-lawyer reality, this sort of got to do the work. You've got to get to the roots of what is guiding the place now and blend the varying factors, be they historical, natural, equitable. John's type of exercise can inform a situation very well in the right context too. I did not mean to sound totally humanistic in my presentation either. But anyway, I'll end the way Rob did. Character, yes. Fairness, yes. And otherwise I'll be repeating myself if I don't stop now. Thanks.
Thanks, Chuck. And John?
Okay, I'm going to use I'm almost going to quote Gordon Brown then. I agree with Chuck. If any of you get you'll get the joke, hopefully. Subjectivity, this whole topic of character is extremely difficult. And it's a kind of a yes and a no answer. Yeah, people like different things. You ask, and in terms of defining character and working with stakeholders to come up with the basis of a design code, which is the kind of thing, Rob, you were mentioning earlier. I mean, that's dangerous in itself because it depends on who you're talking to. You know, who comes along to the event, who actually talks loudest, perhaps gets their view in terms of what's accepted as part of the basis of a design code. And yet at the same time, research that we did, it's actually about 6 or 7 years ago now, before we started developing VIEWCUE as a tool, and we were working on assessing the fractal geometry of places. And we did projects in the UK, and we also did one in Taipei in Taiwan. And we actually found that the type of view that people like, the type of character that people liked in the UK and in Taiwan tended to have similar characteristics of enclosure, of view length, of combinations of buildings and vegetation. It wasn't that people always liked places that were highly vegetated or highly urban streets, that there was definitely a kind of a blend, a mixture. There was a question that I think it was Martina. Yeah, Martina, you've put up on chat. You know, in terms of this texture analysis that I talk about, as an objective measure of the character of a place, or the results of the positioning of elements that form character, is there an assumption that a high texture is always better? And I think it's not a simple answer, in that within certain types of street, within certain types of place, it does seem that the higher textures are usually seen as being more attractive. But it isn't that one particular level of texture trumps everything else. And when we look at the way we've classified views, we start to see there's a whole range of different view types, from highly urban to highly natural. And And nothing in VIEWCUE actually tells us whether something is good or bad. We still actually, and we can't get away from, we still actually need some objective external judgments of which texture or which combination of elements is actually seen as being good or not so good in a specific place. So I think the answer to this kind of, what do we feel about subjectivity versus objectivity is, yes, there is in all of us a degree of subjectivity, but I do think underlying that there is a core of kind of what makes us feel good and what's acceptable. But it's even more complex, because in running workshops, I've asked people several times, so what's the most attractive area of your town? Which is the area that's got the most positive character? And quite often that area is the medieval centre with its narrow streets, its overhanging buildings, its mature trees. That's the most attractive. And then you ask people, where would you like to live? Would you like to live there? No, I don't want to live there. Why not? Oh, I prefer the character of the leafy suburb where I can park my car on the drive. So there's this dichotomy also of, what are you actually asking people? Do you like the look of it, or do you like the feel of it? I think they're quite different things.
Oh, that's useful. It is a very complex topic, and hence that's why we continue to talk about it. During the presentations, I also thought about Jan Gehl's probably too often quoted life, space, then buildings in that order. And the built form that we see is often the result of processes or culture, activity. And it's interesting to think that the planning system in the UK very much is interested in the aesthetic or the outcome in a very concrete sense before it's built and having all the details known. And I just wonder, and I guess I'll go in the order, so as not to repeat as before, to Chuck, John, and then Rob. How do we account for character beyond the visual, especially within the planning system that looks for that ultimate aesthetic of it, when ultimately character can come from the vitality of a place, which is about people and activities and these other aspects, as if character and distinctiveness isn't complex enough. Chuck?
Yeah, thanks, guys. So I think you're asking is how do we get at these other elements of character when all the focus tends to be on the physical? Is that your question? Is that fair restatement? Okay. Well, I think there are processes that some are built into systems, and it doesn't matter what country you're in. Some of these things are built into the regulatory system, the consultations, the ability to protest or comment, and so on and so forth, whereby people are able to articulate some of the softer issues that you're speaking to. But I do think it may mean some further system reinvention, which is difficult everywhere. But at this time, this is where we're perhaps a bit blessed by coming out of the pandemic and the realization that people who are actually in place may have something to say. I'll tell you that in Kiruna, in Sweden, and again, it was a bit of a luxury situation, a mining company funding the entire movement of a town. That was as simple as having coffee with people and asking them what they thought and about their memories and what was intrinsic to them about a given place. And that does not mean buildings. That I can give you some examples. It means moving, if you're going to move the church, are you going to move the cemetery as well? Are you going to move the trees that have that delightful relationship with the existing building? What about the park? Now, this is a physical improvement aspect. What about the park bench where my husband and I met 40 years ago? It is trite, but I think the types of consultations that pull one out of what the reference earlier about just who happens to be able to come to the meeting that night, or even in our enlightened time, who happens to be able to get on the video conference call to comment on a project. That's just essential. And I've come to that realization based on my experience being very process oriented, and helping people get things done, and trying to pull all the tricks to sometimes deny people a voice or to cut them off. That's a very, very good question. I think we could go on forever with that question, and there are entire conferences about it. Some people will take digital tools and queue them up in a way that enhances not just the look, but also the feel. I'll tell one final story, and that is I have a good friend and I did a video interview of her on my little video series a couple of weeks ago. She's a very, very talented and accomplished American landscape architect. She fancies her place in a project, and she's worked on some amazing projects like the gardens of the Gates Foundation in Seattle. Her firm's worked on the reflecting pool in the National Capitol in Washington, D.C. She views her job is to go cartoon the natural history of the site, to get people thinking and feeling in almost an indigenous people's deep listening sort of way what it is they're working with. What are the natural patterns of the site? Why is it that this hill is a little bit higher? Is it some historic, so anyway, there's a whole range of tools, some of which I've picked, I've talked about in my writing. But I think it takes, the fear I have is that in any country, in any rebuilding mode or jobs oriented mode, these types of careful considerations will fall by the wayside. That's my fear. So.
Okay. And John, I think it'd be really interesting to hear in the context of the tool that's quite visual, I guess maybe even in the context of how it's used as a tool to maybe consider these wider considerations.
Okay. I want to respond in two ways. The second way would be to try and pick up what you've just asked Scott about the use of the tool. So how do we account for non-visual character? And you used a really interesting word, which was vitality, or kind of vibrancy. And I think as urban designers then, we need to design in variety of experience. And I think a way of doing that is to actually design with connectivity in mind. So if you cast your minds back, I'm sure everybody's familiar with the space syntax type analysis. Connected streets attract busy type uses, attract people. So the main street, the high street, is busy and vibrant. So some people who like to live in a busy, vibrant place would have the option of being able to live in that place. Now, that was my parents a long time ago. And then they changed, didn't they? And they wanted a different character of place. But they still wanted to be kind of close to their really nice town centre that they'd grown to love. So by then, if we design to connect with connectivity in mind, we'll be designing in those quieter spaces, those more secluded spaces, where we'll naturally start to deliver kind of lower density housing perhaps, but still, hopefully, within easy walking distance of the high street. So if we base our design on an understanding of connectivity, for me, that gives us an underlying kind of ethos of designing in variety of experience. Now, interestingly, to back up something else we're doing with VIEWCUE, we commissioned YouGov to do a survey in November last year, and we interviewed 2,500 people. One of the things we were asking was about, what kind of street do you like? Would you like to live in a quiet, tranquil street, or do you want a place that's busy and vibrant? And only 12% of those 2,500 people that were statistically sampled, so we got representative kind of age groups, only 12% said they wanted to live in a busy and vibrant place, and virtually everybody else wanted a quiet street, and virtually everybody else wanted a tree-lined street. There's a load of other information in that survey that I can't quite bring to mind now. So I think designing in for the non-visual is actually about understanding as urban designers connectivity and actually designing land uses based on connectivity. And then there's a whole other layer of almost like the painting, the art of urban design, which I guess comes back to the visual texture stuff. How does that connect with this non-visual variety and non-visual character? I guess there is a pattern that I'm now imagining this. I've got this matrix of different view classifications, and I know that there are a group of images that have got certain classification, a certain level of texture that represent suburban streets, quiet, leafy suburbs. And I know there's a set of textures that represent very clearly Victorian terraced streets, or that represent kind of city centre streets. So I think there is a connectivity between what you see and what the place will actually feel like. But I can't give you that as in a quantified way. But maybe we could find a way, me being able to share with the whole group outside this session the matrix of images, and it might make it a bit more visibly graspable for everyone. Okay, thanks, Scott.
Yeah, really interesting. And Rob, the question focusing on the non-visual or the other elements, it relates to when you're talking about Patrick Edis and saying what's important and how do we think about the place. And I guess it's relating to when we think about the place, how do we think of those other aspects and how do we take those on board?
I thought Chuck's example of deciding whether to move the cemetery was an interesting one, in that it's obviously, well, probably something that's mainly not relating to appearance, but it would be, and equivalent, more common equivalent might be, whether to build on a cemetery. But a really tricky question of, well, you can get in the professionals, but they're not going to be able to tell you whether the right answer is to move the cemetery or to build on the cemetery. The question is, well, how much do people value the cemetery? And of course, the answer is, well, some people value it greatly and don't want it to be built on or moved, and other people don't value it at all for various reasons, and are happy for it to be moved or destroyed or built on. And somehow, we need to have a political process, and that's why urban design and planning happen through political processes, which make those difficult political decisions where there isn't a correct professional answer. Professionals can advise, but they can't come up with the actual answer. I use place check, which I like. I think John's mapping techniques is fantastic, but it's far too complicated for me. Originally, the place check method had 150 questions, and they're still on the placecheck.info website that people can ask as they look around the site. But actually, when doing a place check, and there's I think about 200 live ones on at the moment, actually we ask three questions: what do we like, what do we dislike, and what do we need to work on? And I'm always amazed about how much information you can get out by going around an area with a bunch of people asking those questions. And you don't need to ask more complex questions, because the things that people would need prompting on, well, probably they're not important. People know what's important, and they can say and record about the what they value and what is important. And once you've done the place check, that's just the start of the process. You then need to say, well, okay, if these are the things we want to work on, these are the things we like and dislike, what are we going to do about it? And that ends up as in the political planning process, where we need to make these difficult decisions. Okay.
Yep. Thanks, Rob. There's a couple of points, and it builds on what you were just saying, Rob, of really who should be defining character. And someone wrote something to the effect that local people aren't asked what works well in an area or what's good in the area. And I also remember being at a consultation event where a well-known designer once said, well, Bob might have a view, but my view is more important because I think about this 24 hours a day. I've studied it my entire life, so on and so forth. And it's interesting to question, I guess, and understand how should we assess local character with the local people, with professionals, and with the planners and politicians? It would just be good to hear people's thoughts. And I guess we'll go in reverse order with John, Chuck, and then Rob, if that's okay.
Oh, thanks, Scott.
Sorry for putting you on the spot.
Yeah, the most difficult one, haven't you? Yeah, it goes back to this, it's almost like, what is democracy? Who do you take notice of? So I'm trying to relate this back to my experience of running consultation workshops. Not just consultation workshops, but kind of outreach, going into schools, going into community centres. I mean, this is the kind of thing that I think Rob Cowan's got massive experience of actually doing. How the hell do we go about it? I mean, I've been having conversations with a number of local authorities about the potential of using this VIEWCUE tool and actually getting local communities, particularly we're thinking about small neighbourhoods or villages, to actually run their own analysis so they can see the structure of the village. And I think when I was running consultation workshops, I used to run a consultancy called Urban Design and Mediation. And we always felt that when we were running an event, we needed to, one, be very careful that we were getting a representative, if you like, not sample, but a representative group of people at the workshop, not just the people who'd been thinking about it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But we also always felt that there was a need for us to do some, and I don't mean this in a patronising way, but some education, to actually give the participants some tools to really be able to understand the place, as opposed to simply coming forward and going, I like that, I don't like that. And so one of the things we constantly did was to ask why. Why do you like that? What would be the benefit of that particular choice and that particular decision? So I think it's quite tricky to simply drop into or work with a group of people and simply ask that as a broad question. I think it's our responsibility, I guess, as professionals who talk about this stuff 24/7, to actually share some of the techniques and help people develop their own values to decide what they like, what they don't like. But also, I think it's important to ask that question why, and justify a person's recommendation. I think that's about as far as I can go in answering this tricky one. I'll hand over to whoever's coming next.
I was going to say tricky question, but an excellent response. And I think also in the context of the tool that you showed, that it's the tool is part of a larger process of understanding places and design. And then,
one thing I'd like to say, sorry, I kind of interrupt at this point, is to say what I showed you using VIEWCUE, nothing in there told you whether anything was good or bad. It just told you that it was. We still have to make we still have to have our external kind of subjective measurement of deciding which texture or which character is actually good or bad.
Great. Chuck?
Thank you. So I agree with much of what John said. And in fact, my version of that was my second book, Seeing the Better City, which was actually, when I came to the UK, it had already been nominated as a finalist for the Urban Design Award in 2018. So I know it resonated, because what did I try and do? Exactly what John said. I tried to design a way for people to understand why it was they liked, disliked, why did their knee jerk in response to certain things. And, I think in summary, it's about a system redesign that empowers people to come to the table in different ways with some training, or perhaps some understanding that their limited training from a professional perspective is just fine, and they have as valid a voice as anyone else. Now, my tool, which was modeled before I had ever met Rob Cowan, a lot on Rob's place check, was something called the Urban Diary. And the idea was to empower citizens to participate in a more visual dialogue than just come to the meeting and complain. And essentially I designed a whole system of photographic inputs and some potential for this to be uploaded to local authorities, to councils, and so on and so forth. So I think, I don't mean to overemphasize my own work. I just think that people need to be very creative in doing what John has just said. Now, another American example, forgive me, is that in the city I'm from, Seattle, is a quite advanced approach to design review. And the way in which design review occurs is with neighborhood design review boards, not citywide, that have specified memberships. And, there may be an architect, there may be someone familiar with X, Y, or Z, but a few at least are ordinary people. Now, there's a problem sometimes in training them to be good decision makers and abiding by the design guidelines of their particular part of town. But what I'm saying, I think, is that in other places, governments have experimented with approaches that attempt to empower through the regulatory system. Now, private developers can do the same thing in private consultations. There's a vast array of thinking on this subject, but I had already said earlier that I can't emphasize enough the importance of talking and listening to local populations. And sometimes it's just that, and sometimes it's also having the ability to speak through translation or through working with trusted intermediaries and so on and so forth. It's a lot of work, but if one does things right, it's part of this deep dive that I've been advocating for.
Great, thank you. And Rob?
Yeah, I think planning works well when it becomes a learning process. And if it's not a learning process, then local residents, the public, have their particular point of view. Professionals have their particular weird point of view and knowledge and experience. Politicians have their particular way of working and thinking, and they can all learn from each other, and they should learn from each other. But there aren't naturally methods of doing that. What I like about Place Check is just getting people onto the street, which is the very most basic method of learning. Getting people on the street and walking around and saying, what do we think? Talking to each other. And we need to do that. And particularly planners who, never seem to get out behind their desks. We need to either find simple ways of doing that, or we need to build them into our processes of planning and consultation and participation, as Patrick Geddes did. And, when he was planning an area, he would organize a festival, build into existing festivals, work with the faith communities, arts organization, the local culture, local organizations of all kinds. And that can be difficult to do. It can be sometimes expensive and slow to do. But if we don't do it, as we so often don't, planning is just the uncreative, undistinctive process that is so often depressing today.
Great. That was a really nice summing up. Look, I asked for questions, and there were some interesting points about talking about authentic from Mark Pearson and Paul Bratton talked about challenging the standard house type. And also Katerina mentioned the Lego Serious Play. And we could have all separate sessions just on those topics by themselves, as well as the points that the three of our panel members mentioned during this question and answer session. But I'd like to wrap it up. I think we had 3 great presentations and a really, really rich series of responses from our panel. So definitely a virtual round of applause to you guys. And thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.